Okay, our speaker tonight is a PhD in communications, which we were trying to figure out earlier what that meant. He's Mike Else, and he's a university instructor.
Off and on.
And he said it's probably hurt him that he's become a libertarian in the last couple of years. So maybe talk a little bit about how you found out about us and what changed your mind.
Really, that was way off topic.
Well, at least start with that.
No, but it would be interesting. It's always a pretty human touch to your talk.
Human touch.
How
I'm not really
the
good at
social
improvising.
contract.
Michael McConkey.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you all, one and all, for coming, laying down your hard-earned shekels and sacrificing your Saturday night. I appreciate it. Okay, so I'm going to try and improvise and respond to the request to say something about myself before I begin. Yes, I spent most of my life as a leftist of one kind or another. I was actually a Leninist for about 6 months at one point, became gradually disenchanted with that. In the 90s, I sort of drifted towards postmodernism, which is where Marxists go to hide after the fall of the Soviet Union. Then, after 9/11, for 5 years, I think I was a neoconservative, or at least I tried to be a neoconservative anyways. I went and read all the Irving Kristol and Norman Horowitz and all that stuff, and it was they're actually interesting thinkers because they're all Trotskyists, really, if we come right down to it. They're all Jacobins, in fact. They're Jacobins. You study the French Revolution, conservatives are Jacobins. But anyways, and then I was like, there was this show called Uncommon Knowledge. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It has a lot of neoconservatives on it, and I was watching this one day, and they had Richard Epstein on. Anarchist, libertarian, legal scholar, and I thought, this guy's interesting, so I started reading his stuff. This is about 3 years ago. So I started reading his stuff, and gradually I sort of inched my way, because he kind of likes Hayek a little bit, so that got me to read Hayek, and then from that I sort of got Mises and this sort of thing, and my way. And Paul was disappointed to know that the big moment came. I was actually sitting on my beautiful little porch in my little place in Thailand, where I go over the pool. I can picture it now perfectly. And I was reading, and I've read several essays by Rothbard at this point, and I kind of like, I don't know. But then I was reading the essay he wrote for the Cato Journal on neutral taxation. And like halfway through this essay, it's like, the scales fall from your eyes, and oh Christ, I understand now. And ever since then, I've been corrupted, and I can't get a job anymore at university. But that's okay. I don't mind. So that's a little background. So for remarks tonight, I had something particular I wanted to talk to you about. It may be a little different, from what's done in the past. I don't know, but it's something that I've been paying a lot of attention to. Recently, trying to get a better grasp on, and I thought it might be time to share it with others, so you can give me some feedback. So there is actually a paper I've written. It's a draft, but it's a respectable draft. So if anything I say tonight is of interest to you, by all means, email me, and I'll happily send you a copy of the paper, and you can give me feedback if you so. But I will say that the topics on which I'm going to be discussing, I do not pretend to be an expert and a dilettante working in secondary sources, so if you, at the end, you want to ask me some, sophisticated question about nuances of medieval historiography or something, I probably won't be able to answer it. But I'll give it a try. And I don't know how you normally work it, but it would be easier for me if you just let me talk, and then questions and criticisms and comments and jury can all be kept to the end, because I will lose my train of thought. I predict right now I'll lose my train of thought at least 3 times. But if we're having lots of talking, then I'll never finish this at all. So time to is that it? I think that's all my preparatory remarks. Okay, so as you know, the theme of the remarks is the myth of the social contract. And I wanted to start off by clarifying what I mean by that. I mean what I call the implicit social contract. Because you probably most of you know, in political philosophy, there's social contract tradition associated to Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and these people. And that will come up in what I have to say, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this idea, and we've all encountered it, I'm sure, and most of you have probably known this longer than me, or more adept than I in dealing with it when you encounter it, but this people whom have this assumption that somehow society is kind of a superorganism, that we're all somehow part of this, whether we like it or not. And most of these people, I don't think have ever heard of Thomas Hobbes. Most of them aren't familiar with the idea that in philosophy there's something called social contract theory, and yet they hold this idea somehow implicitly that society is a superorganism, that somehow we're all part of this collective. So I started off with wanting, as part of a larger project to try and understand the state. What I really want to do is write a book on the state. But it occurred to me that this is a major obstacle to try and get people to think critically about the state. And I wanted to understand what lies underneath or behind this assumption of the implicit social contract, and how does it tie together with the idea of the state. And this has taken me back into history, which after all is my domain. So this is the topic I'd like to share with you tonight. So as kind of a forewarning or foreshadowing, like our literary illusions, I would say, when we get to the end of this, maybe you'll find that when you encounter people who make this argument, if those people are religious, or better still, Christians, then in a certain sense I think you have to give them good deal. Now, I don't mean that you concede the argument to them. They still, the burden of proof is still on them to prove that this social organism exists in the material way. It's not just projected on their fantasy, but they're being logically consistent. However, the people you encounter who make this argument are secularists or atheists, well, then they're engaging in a sort of laughable self-contradiction in terms of their own intellectual framework that they don't understand. Because what I want to try and convey to you is my growing belief. Like I said, this is all still in the process, but I'm becoming increasingly convinced that where this all begins is with Christian theology. And the way in which certain doctrines from Christian theology were smuggled into political philosophy and legal theory during particularly during the medieval era into the later medieval era. And then how these ideas have been adapted to changing historical circumstances leading up to the situation where we are today. So this is the situation, this is what you're going to be confronted with. So I hope you're ready for it. Buckle up. So the particular Christian doctrine that's important here is what's called the two bodies of Christ. So early Christian theologians developed this idea that Christ had two bodies. I'll briefly touch on some of the reasons for this, but there's more to it. This idea that Christ has two bodies. On the one hand, Christ has a natural body, the body of a flesh and blood human being. This guy Jesus, right, was born in Nazareth, carpenter, child of Mary and Lady Joseph, I don't know. But this is just a flesh and blood body, the human body. And this body can perish. It can suffer and it can die, presumably, all of which happened to Christ on the cross. And yet, interestingly enough, Christ can come back, presumably. I know there's disputes in Christian doctrine about this, but I think most Christians believe that at the end of days, Christ will return, and he'll be in a different natural body. It won't be the body of Jesus. That's gone, right? That turned to dust a long time ago, right? So he'll be in a different natural body. But this is funny because, I mean, for Christian explanation of this, I mean, we can't fall back on reincarnation, right? Because believe in reincarnation we're not strictly talking about a soul, because everyone has a soul, but not everyone can do that. So how is it possible that Christ can do this? Well, the reason he can do it is because he continues to live in the world despite the death of the natural body, and he lives in the world because he has this second body, which they call the mystical body of Christ. Now, the mystical body of Christ, in addition to allowing Christ to inhabit yet another natural body at the end of days, had the additional, and for our purposes much more important benefit, of manifesting itself in the world through the bringing together of all Christians into a single Christendom. And this idea was that all Christians, from the very beginning, because of course they believed they were Christians before Christ, that's why they got the Old Testament in there in the Bible, right? Up to the very present day. So all Christians, past and present, in all places at all times, are bound together in the mystical body of Christ. So what happens here is this notion of the mystical body of Christ turns Christianity into a form of collective unity. Everyone is bound together into this single body. The language of body is, as we'll see, becomes very important. So what happens there? Actually, along the way, I'll mention, if anyone's actually interested in this, I'll mention some fascinating books that I discovered along the way. One book that really blew me away is by Ernest Kantorowicz called The King's Two Bodies. And this massive, detailed book, he goes with great precision, goes through the story of how the canonists and jurists of the medieval era took these ideas of the two bodies of Christ and smuggled them into political philosophy and legal theory for the specific ends of serving the power ambitions of the medieval kings. Now, this was possible to do in part. This was possible to do in part because there was a kind of spectrum in place in which it became slippery along the spectrum as to where Christ and kings stood exactly. I mean, Christ was clearly closer to humans than God was because Christ had been in a human body. Right? But the kings were also considered kind of closer to God than humans were. And if you look at the iconography of the time, the symbolism, right? It's easy to make this kind of slippery association because it becomes common to refer to Christ as being the King of Christendom. And you'd see pictures of him, sitting on his throne in heaven, wearing his crown, not the crown of thorns, of course, but when he's on his throne in heaven, he's wearing a great crown of gems and so forth, right? This kind of thing. So he looks and is regarded as a king, and even a lot of the symbolism, like the sun, the rays of light emitting from the back of the head in paintings and this kind of thing, right? And by the 13th century, we find references to the kings as Christos, which mean God-men. So the idea that they're almost like gods, or they're kind of like God's representative in the secular world, or something like this. So this kind of slipperiness becomes possible. So what happens is that the jurists start evolving this idea that in fact, as the kings are in some ways almost meeting Christ in sort of the middle of the spectrum, that it's reasonable to think that the king too would have two bodies. And so they start evolving. This takes about 300 years for this thing to go through the full evolution, but to cut a long story short. Again, we find the king has a natural body, just like Christ, but this the flesh and blood man who sits on the throne, right? But this body can perish, it can die, right? But of course, the king never really dies, right? He can embody another flesh and blood body, which with time comes to be his heirs, right? This idea that somehow the son of the king would naturally become the king, this was not, through most of the medieval period, this wasn't assumed. This took the importation of the mystical body doctrine, the two bodies doctrine, into legal theory to establish this as a legal principle. And so this idea that the king, that the son of the king would take over, it's not that he's the son of the king, he's still the king. And the medieval toast, which I think a lot of people now think of as like a Monty Python joke or something, but it's really, the king is dead, long live the king. Medieval people meant this quite seriously.